Good day, and welcome to the first web talk in 2021 of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. I'm Andrea Spindle and the moderator for today. The Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation has been bringing attention to Canadians of growing anti-Semitism for almost 20 years, and during that time has provided significant educational lectures by local and international speakers, experts who sounded the alarm on anti-Zionism and the lies of occupation, apartheid, and Palestinian Arab history in the Jewish homeland. There is no Palestinian Arab history, and until 1967, there were no such people. The lies have been expanded grotesquely and gargantuanly, and with them, threats to our society and our democracy as a whole. It was ever thus. Anti-Semitism is the spark, but the fire of hatred grows and consumes much in its path and is a threat to all minorities, to all lovers of freedom and people of goodwill. We must join and expand our efforts to confront Jew hatred and defend Jewish civil rights in Canada and Jewish rights to our self-determination in our ancestral homeland. To this end, CAEF is launching End Jew Hatred Canada, and we'll be speaking more about it in upcoming webinars and in our weekly bulletin. You can read the background now on our website at www.caef.ca and donate now to help grow this grassroots Jewish civil rights movement. One of the most informed and eloquent speakers about the connection between progressivism and social justice causes and growing anti-Semitism is Dr. Aurel Braun. Aurel Braun is currently a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. He is also a center associate at the Davis Center at Harvard University. Additionally, he is a senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and a fellow and senator of Trinity College, all at the University of Toronto. Between July 2012 and June 2015, he was a visiting professor teaching in the Department of Government at Harvard University. Professor Braun has twice been appointed a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. In March 2009, the federal cabinet, via governor and council appointment, made Professor Braun the chairman of the board of directors of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development. In December 2012, Professor Braun was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for services to Canada and for academic distinction by the Governor General of Canada. Professor Braun has published extensively on communist affairs and strategic studies with a special focus on the problems of the transformation of the socialist systems in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. He is also a specialist in international law and the author of several books. I am very pleased to welcome Aurel Braun today. After his presentation, we will have time for questions, so I direct you to the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. Please feel free to post a question. We'll try to answer as many as possible, but everyone will be kept on mute during this webinar. Thank you for attending today and welcome, Professor Braun.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation, and especially thank you to Andrea for your persistence and convincing me to do this. It is a topic that one wishes one would not need to address today. That when we look at the Enlightenment, at the supposed movement at tolerance, at the attempts at diversity, one would like to believe that such issues, such as anti-Semitism, which rightfully has been called the oldest hatred, would have been resolved. That this would be something that we would look at it from a historical lens, not as a current concern. But the reality is that the long arc of history has not managed to transcend anti-Semitism. In fact, anti-Semitism has evolved. It endures and it continually transmogrifies. This is why we use in the title old wine. And it is at one level, of course, extremely distressing to have to recognize the reality of anti-Semitism, what we are confronting. But I want to say right at the beginning that we are neither helpless nor is the situation hopeless in the face of this scourge, that there are things we can do, things that we should do, and things that we must do. So I'm going to talk about the nature of the threat and then some thoughts, second, as to how we may address this. So you may have seen in some news reports that there is an inquiry at one of the colleges of the University of California, a very distinguished system of universities that includes Berkeley, UCLA, and others, regarding a professor who is alleged to have made what could be characterized as extremely disturbing anti-Semitic statements. And let me just go over some of the things that he has put on his website. It included tweeting a photo of what he called the Zionist brain. And in this photo, there were labels of various parts of the brain. One was the lobe that was labeled World Domination Lobe. Another one was called the frontal money lobe. A third one was the Holocaust Memory Center. It was very similar to what had appeared on the viciously anti-Semitic website, Jew World Order. But this is the 21st century. This is in California. This is a highly educated individual who is alleged to have done this. And when we look closely and just think about the term Zionist brain, frontal money lobe, the world domination lobe, this is very much similar to the traditional anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish domination, of conspiracy, of greed, of basically portraying Jews as the other, as people who don't belong, but are a threat to the world. And as I was looking at this, and as disturbing as this is, and it is not rare, sadly, in the academic world, using the term Zionism to really designate Jews, to use Israel as a way of talking about the international Jew, the cosmopolitan Jew, the Jews in general. It reminded me that in a few months' time, we're going to be facing Passover. And I'm not a theologian, but there's one passage that is really striking when we do the services. And it says, in each and every generation, they rise up against us to destroy us. Again, in each and every generation, they rise up against us and destroy us. Now, obviously, this was first a Jewish concern. But when we think about it, this really is a human concern. Because it is not just a matter of Jewish paranoia or fear or just a threat to Jewish people, but it is a commentary on the character and nature of humanity. And that is that there is somehow in human beings a kind of virus always present that can become virulent, that the possibilities of hatred, of extremism, just don't go away. That Jews, in a sense, the canaries in the mine, but it is not only about Jews. It may start with Jews, but as it had been said, it doesn't end with Jews. And so, because we have this in every generation, it means that we always need to be vigilant against anti-Semitism, against extremism, and not just Jews, but everyone else. And this is why the essence of democracy is, unlike Marxism, democracy assumes that human beings are capable of both good and evil, and that we try to create structures, we try to limit what evil can be done, where we try to channel human activity towards beneficial effects. But we are aware of this predilection, that it can go the wrong way. And what that means is that you never resolve it once and for all. Only totalitarian systems talk about, or extreme theological systems talk about a once and for all solution. What democracies talk about is a continuous struggle. This is what Jefferson talked about. Democracies are a continuing struggle. And so the fight against anti Semitism must be a continuing struggle. It is not a matter of pessimism, it is realism. And the sooner we understand that, the better it will be, the more effective we can be in fighting anti Semitism, in fighting all kinds of extremism, because anti Semitism is the oldest, but it is one of many manifestations, but it is one of the most vicious ones, possibly the most vicious one ever. Now, the sources of anti Semitism are multiple. And given the experience the Jews have had in Europe, the experiences that we've had as a result of the Holocaust, there's a natural predilection to look at extremism from the extreme right. And there is no question that there are extremists on the extreme right. We saw in the assault on the Capitol, the man wearing the Camp Auschwitz t shirt. And the extreme elements on the far right are real, are threatening. They need to be addressed. It is important to recognize them. But at the same time, it is also essential to understand that it's not just a matter of fighting the old wars, but looking at the new issues. And the greatest danger on campuses does not come from the right. I wrote about the extreme right. I wrote a whole book, The Extreme Right, Freedom and Security at Risk. The threat comes mainly from the left on campuses. There is a kind of intellectual distortion of what rights are. It is from the far left going all the way back to Marx that we have a kind of embedded anti-Semitism. Marx was an anti-Semite. Marx was also a racist, and so was Lenin. And yet they used race as a means of trying to attack capitalism or the free market. They used it very cynically. And Lenin used Jews. And look at Stalin. The viciousness of Stalin's anti-Semitism was absolute, it was virulent. And had he lived, there would have been a new pogrom against Jews. Already many Jews in the Doctors' Plot had been arrested and they would have died. And many Jews died under Stalin. They were victimized, whether they were in the Politburo or elsewhere. And this is often something that we refuse to recognize. To what extent anti-Semitism came from communism, from the left, and to what extent current anti-Semitism on campuses is embedded in Marxism and neo-Marxist thought. And I want to look at a number of areas here where this kind of Marxist or neo-Marxist approach has created a new form of anti-Semitism that is disguised as anti-Zionism, but in character, it is very similar to traditional anti-Semitism. It is dangerous, it is growing, and it is not adequately recognized. And certainly, we have not addressed it sufficiently well. And the sooner we take additional steps, the better it will be, not just for Jews, but for everyone's freedom. Because what is happening first in attacks on Zionism ultimately is a danger to civil society, it is a danger to democracy. And that is why this should be a fight that everyone ought to be interested in. So let me begin with the first one, the first element, and that is the rise of what has been called intersectionality. And as many ideas, they start out as ambitious and sometimes even noble undertakings where we look at some historical grievances, certain problems that ought to be addressed, and there is little doubt that minorities of various sorts, especially people of color, have suffered discrimination, have suffered terrible oppression in the past, and there are issues today as well. So the purpose of intersectionality was to try to create this kind of linkage between all oppressed people, all kinds of minorities everywhere around the world, who would be subject to discrimination, who would be subject to various forms of racism, of microaggression. The problem is that this has become a kind of identity politics that instead of being inclusionary, has become exclusionary. What it has combined with the denunciation, what is called whiteness. That whiteness is oppressive. And many of you may have read that book, White Fragility, which is an awful, dishonest treatise that has been foisted upon the corporate world and sometimes even upon the academic world. And what intersectionality has done is it has created a type of binary approach. On the one hand, you have the oppressed, and on the other hand, you have the oppressors. And in the case of Jews, and the vast majority of Jews are Zionists, so the term Zionist is code, what therefore is alleged is that they fall into the other category of oppressors. They are the other, as in traditional anti-Semitism. They are the oppressor. So you have the BIPOC people on the one hand and Jews on the other. And in a way, what the thrust of this is that intersectionality is about protecting those who have been disadvantaged. It is a fight against privilege. And Jews are designated as privileged and white. And this is not only bizarre, but it is so intellectually dishonest. Why would Jews be considered white by those standards? By those standards, Jews are certainly not white. And it's not even the case when you look physically at Jews in terms of pigmentation and so on. It's the entire rainbow. But how would Jews be considered privileged? Are there any people who have suffered more discrimination, greater tragedy, more persecution over a more prolonged period of time than Jews? When I was at Stanford, I remember having a conversation with Marty Lipset, the very distinguished sociologist and political scientist, Seymour Martin Lipset. And Martin Lipset's first job was at the University of Toronto in Canada. And he said that in 1948, this is post-war, after the Holocaust, there was a conference, an academic conference that was held off campus. And there were banners at the entrance of that hotel which said, "No Jews allowed in this hotel." 1948, Toronto. So where is the privilege? Where's the privilege that Israel has, a country that reconstituted the Jewish homeland, the national liberation of the Jewish people, of the indigenous people, surrounded by countries that wish to destroy it, which is threatened by Iran, which seeks to get nuclear weapons, whose regime has clearly stated that it views Israel as a cancer that it wishes to destroy, where you have leaders such as Erdogan of Turkey making the most vitriolic anti-Semitic statements, or Egypt, which is supposed to have a peace treaty with Israel, but where the protocols of elders of Zion, the notorious Tsarist forgery, has been published and circulated as fact. So is there privilege? Is there whiteness? So this intersectionality on campus excludes Jews and categorizes them as white and as oppressive. This takes me to the second point, and that of indigeneity. Indigenous people are viewed to have rights that have been taken away and need to be restored. But why is it that in this there is no acknowledgement of Jews as the indigenous people of the Middle East? On the contrary, we have on campuses serious scholars, supposedly, who talk about Jews as an invented people, where this old distorted historical myth that Jews were what Khazars who converted, when we have genetic proof that this is not the case, is still being circulated. And then added to this, since Jews are not allowed to be viewed or to call themselves indigenous people, and that is essential. So always think that when it is denied to Jews that they are indigenous to the Middle East, that is the beginning of coming to the designation that they are part of a colonial enterprise. They are part of Western imperialism. And this is classic Marxist accusations. Because if you are part of a colonial enterprise, if you are part of Western imperialism, you have no legitimacy. You are basically someone who takes and really steals other people's rights. And that is why the insistence on indigeneity is so absolutely crucial. And we don't do enough of that. Now, the third element is, how do these elements of intersectionality and indigeneity really work when there ought to be opposition from Jews and non-Jews who know better? Well, this is where there's something very clever that again goes back to how the communists operated in the Soviet Union and how they used fellow travelers. And that is, Lenin and Stalin always made use of Jews to persecute other Jews. The vast majority of Jews were never communists, but some Jews played a very prominent role in communism. And they were used by the regimes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union against other Jews. They were used against populations in general in the most cynical fashion. And you see this today as well. A small minority, fringe group of people who call themselves Jews will rush to the fore and say, yes, Israel is not an indigenous entity. Yes, Israel is an apartheid state. Yes, Israel is an occupying power. Yes, Israel is a tool of Western imperialism. Yes, Israel is a colonial enterprise. And these are what I call Jews of convenience, JOCONs, JOCONs. Remember that term. They are used by the left. They are willing tools often. And when they address the issue, almost invariably, they will start the conversation. Well, I, as a Jew, reject the occupation. I, as a Jew, oppose the policies. I, as a Jew. And you have to ask yourself, why would you start a conversation that way? If you have an argument, should not the argument stand on its own? Why would you need to identify yourself in a particular way? Would that grant validity to a poor argument? And if you do have a good argument, there's no need for that. But these are Jews of convenience. And the problem is that they have not been rejected sufficiently by the community. And that is not that they should be censured or persecuted. That is not the nature of democratic action and thought. But what ought to be made clear is that the JOCONs represent themselves, not the community. They are entitled to say what they wish. They are entitled to their opinion without being persecuted or harassed. But they are not entitled to claim that they speak for the community, because they do not. And that we have to insist on. And more than that, it's essential, as many other minority groups will do, who say this is a form of Uncle Thomism. It is evidence of anti-Semitism when you use certain Jews to bash the Jewish community, to bash Israel, to stifle the freedom of Jewish students, Zionist students in general. It is part of this assault on Judaism. It was Soviet propaganda in 1975 and Soviet strategic planning that introduced Zionism as a racism. Zionism equals racism at the United Nations, which then had to be rescinded later on when the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was a vicious but extremely effective attack on Jews. And it wasn't just an attack on Israel, it was a thoroughly anti-Semitic attack. And now you have new forms of that. The meetings in Durban, Durban 1, Durban 2, were a variation on that, on Zionism is racism. Israeli Apartheid Week is a variation of that, because apartheid is not just an adjective. Apartheid is a legal term. We need to understand that. It is a legal term that talks about racial separation and racial oppression and racial persecution. And it is a crime that underpins the Rome Statute, which is the founding statute for the International Criminal Court. And apartheid is one of the major crimes of international law. So if you are an apartheid entity, you are a criminal entity. We have to think about that very carefully. When you are designated an apartheid state, it is that you are a criminal entity that is engaged in one of the greatest violations of international law. You have no standing, you need to be dismantled, and anyone who supports an apartheid state is an accessory to one of the worst crimes in international law. And therefore, you have no standing on campus. And if Israel is an apartheid state, and you, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, any Zionist, anyone who supports Israel's right to exist in any form, is therefore an accessory to one of the most major crimes. And how could you possibly operate on campus? You'll be subject to harassment, to intimidation, and you will lose your rights. And we better understand that. And this is exactly what has been happening on campuses. It has been the very clever and persistent attempt to marginalize Jews using anti-Zionism, claims that this is just criticism of Israel. And this is why the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism is so important. Because contrary to popular myth, it does not stifle criticism of Israel. It allows all forms of criticism. It merely states that criticism, to which no other country is subjected to, is a sign of anti-Semitism. It is the 3 Ds: double standards, discrimination, delegitimization. And that has to be fought. Not criticism of Israel. We all are able to, and we ought to criticize Israel as any other democracy, because every democracy is flawed. But when we criticize Britain or Sweden or Switzerland, we don't question the right of those states to exist. We don't question the value of that state to the international community. We do not suggest that if they are flawed or the policy of government are something that we disagree with, that political entity should be dismantled. But that is exactly what it leads to Israel, because BDS is not about criticizing Israel. As Omar Barghouti, the founder of BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, said very clearly, it is about destroying the state of Israel. And if the state of Israel is the national liberation of the Jewish people, if it is an indigenous entity, that is the most basic form of anti-Semitism, trying to dismantle it. And we need to address that. So let me conclude, because I think we need to have time for questions. Anti-Semitism seems to be a Jewish struggle, but it is not only a Jewish struggle. We make a mistake if we think it is only a Jewish struggle. It is ultimately a human struggle. In every generation, they seek to destroy us. It's not just about the Jewish people. It is for decent people everywhere in the world, for everyone who wants freedom and human dignity. That is the danger. The danger is to that basic notion of freedom and inclusiveness. So intersectionality entirely misses the mark, because it should be inclusive, not exclusive. And we have to reject this notion of oppressive whiteness in the case of Jewish people. And we have to appreciate that anti-Semitism is a kind of virus that may lie dormant, but it is never dead. And it can resurface and can become virulent. We saw it under Corbynism in Britain. And we can see it on campuses today. And though we have to fight all anti-Semitism, whether it's from the extreme right or the extreme left, the reality is that on campuses, it is the extreme left largely that the source is. And this is where the jokons are being used mainly. And so what we must not do is we must not neglect the struggle. We must not ignore that virus. It is not paranoia. It is about vigilance. It is not a matter of rationalizing away problems or allowing ourselves to wallow in guilt for any success that we may have as a people. What we often see in Jewish communities is kind of fashionable self-guilt, or if they become despondent, there may be this kind of fruitless self-pity. But what we need is to be organized. We need to have a sustained commitment in action. It is not just a moral imperative, but it is a reality that we need to understand, and that reality that we must confront. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Braun. I have a couple of questions before I go to the audience. Given what you said about universities, and I think it's quite serious that perhaps they are breeding grounds, educational grounds, whatever you want to use, for creating anti-Semitism. Kids that are unsure of their views, or maybe don't think we even need political views in Israel, seem to be very much influenced by professors who express anti-Zionist feelings and give cover to the justification for criticizing Israel when really it's anti-Semitic. It seems extreme. It seems to be on many campuses. We know about Israel Apartheid Week. We know that there is a move to fight off the adoption of IRA at universities. We know that various pro-Palestinian groups are still holding virtual sessions and vigils, etc. Could you speak specifically to strategies that we might use, particularly when we're not all students, right? That could impact universities? What could we be doing as a community to influence universities?
Universities may not seem as important as they really are in terms of where ideas are germinated and how they spread, but that is where bad ideas most of the time start. And then they leach out of universities into corporations, into government. And by that point, it is very difficult to reverse them. And that is why they have to be fought at the source. What has happened internationally is that as communism collapsed, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the remnants of the Marxism has become even stronger on campuses. And what you will notice is that in most social science departments, it skews very much to the left. You will have departments of political science at places like Cornell or Columbia, where 95% of the department will vote Democratic and 5 or 10% would vote Republican. Now, people should be able to vote any which way they want. But why is it that at universities there is such a distortion from, let's say, the pattern in the general population? And so a special effort has to be made where, whatever the views of the faculty may be, they need to try to be objective with students. And this used to be a pretty important rule at universities, which is increasingly violated, where professors increasingly feel that they need to become activists and that instead of just education, they have a right to engage in indoctrination. And that is where the community needs to speak up, because we should not be sending our students, whether it's to high school, public school, or university, to be indoctrinated. That's not what democratic societies do. A good education is where you have a chance to explore a variety of ideas, and then you can make up your own mind about what is important and what you wish to accept. And increasingly, that is getting constrained. And we have seen that there's an attempt to protect just about every group on campus to the point where sometimes free speech is stifled, but one can understand. We don't want to have the Ku Klux Klan on campus. We don't want to have rabid racists on campus. We don't want to have rabid misogynists. It would be difficult because it can create problems. But you could have the most rabid anti-Zionists come on campus, and that is allowed. So what happens in this kind of situation is that when everyone has protections, but Jews or those who support Israel, and there are lots of non-Jews as well, when they have no protection, they are the only ones who have no protection, then think about it. What is the message that is being sent? Well, if everybody has a legitimate right to protection, and you as a Zionist do not have a right to protection, there must be something very wrong with Zionism. Must be a form of racism. And so you become a second-class citizen, you become ostracized. So this is why it's so important that community leaders should speak up, whether it is rabbis, whether it is uh, uh, various organizations, civil rights organizations, whether it is individuals, whether it is the parents, whether it is donors. Donors do not have an obligation to give to a university that engages in discrimination. Donors should not go to a university and say, I will give you money if you perform the following political service for me. That would be interference. But a donor has a right to say, you are failing your own agreement to protect everyone. You are not abiding by what you promised to your students. What students ought to be entitled to, that they should be able to study in an atmosphere free of harassment and intimidation. And since you're failing to do that, since you essentially engage in discrimination, how could we give you money to encourage that discrimination? That is not interference to subvert. That is basically saying we would like you to live up to the standards that you proclaim.
Right. I would like to introduce something that you may be aware of that I think people would be very interested in. And that is a recent paper was published and shared with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. And the paper spoke about Jewish studies departments not standing up for exactly what you just described as needing to be done, but rather that we've got Jewish faculty in Jewish studies departments who themselves are anti-Zionist and are opposing the adoption of IHRA by universities. And this could be very serious. Have you come into contact with this on campus? Can you make suggestions if our own faculty, I mean, you can call them jocons, but they are there on campus and they're signing petitions to actually obliterate what the community is asking for.
And this is why the use of jocons is so important. This is why it's so central that the Jewish community should do the same thing as the Irish community had done when it was fighting for the independence of Ireland back in the early part of the 20th century, what the Black community has done to denounce Uncle Thomism and to say these people do not represent the community. And what is essential to understand is that 28 plus governments and the European Union, they have adopted the IRA definition. Mm-hmm. So this is not something unusual. That every German university has adopted the IRA definition. That well over 30 universities in Britain have adopted the IRA definition, and that included the top universities, the London School of Economics, University College, Oxford University, University of Oxford, University of Cambridge, NYU in the United States adopted it. So if all these universities have adopted it, how can some of these individuals claim that it would be wrong or it would be a threat, but for, in fact, distorting what IRA is about? Right. Because basically they would be saying, all these other places are wrong. Somehow, those 87 or 90 German universities don't care about the freedom of their students. Or Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, and so on don't care about the freedom of the students. NYU doesn't care about the freedom of the students. So how is it that you, who is in Jewish studies at X university, you care more about that because you insist on pursuing BDS or some other agenda, and you're free to do it on your own time. But don't tell us you're speaking for the Jewish community, and don't tell us that you are speaking for freedom.
Would you agree that maybe we have to do something about imbuing the word Zionism with meaning that people don't understand what it is, that it's easily distorted and or seen to be something that's just a political movement?
It is important to start with the basics. And this is where we have failed in our education system, that we don't teach our students, we don't arm them with what it means to have that connection to the land, that this is not some foreign entity usurping the land, the rights of others, but these are the Jewish people who are the Aboriginal people, who are the indigenous people. Because there's a movement here. Every meeting we have at the University of Toronto, we start with a statement on the land, where we recognize the indigenous people. Maybe. So there are a tremendous amount of irony.
Yeah, maybe we should do that.
There's not a willingness to recognize that Israel is the land of the indigenous people. It doesn't mean there aren't other people, but it is the indigenous people. It is not a colonial enterprise. It is not a Western outpost of oppression. It is a democracy that is remarkable in many ways and flawed in other ways. No democracy is perfect, but it is in many ways a shining example of an ingathering of people, 800,000 refugees from the Arab states who lost their land, people who lived in Yemen for 2,000 years and came home. They were expelled. They came home to Israel. They didn't usurp somebody else's right. It's not that simple. There are disputes with Palestinian Arabs. There were disputes in parts of Europe. There are disputes everywhere in the world. There were exchanges of population. So indigeneity is very important, that Jews are not intruders. They did not just function or do not function as some tool of American imperialism. The second element that is so important to stress is that if intersectionality would have real meaning, Jews should be central in part as part of that intersectionality, because who has been more oppressed, more discriminated against than Jews have been? And third element is to look at the achievements of this small state, of how much benefit it has provided to the international community. Uh, you can't use your internet, you can't use your phone. All sorts of medicines have come from Israel.
Right.
It's a remarkable achievement for a tiny country surrounded by states that had for so long tried to destroy it, and where there are still states like Iran that are committed to its destruction. And so it is a remarkable achievement in human history. It is something that standard sociology could not explain. Because if you just go by standard sociology, Israel should be a wretched dictatorship, uh, living in poverty and utter dictatorship instead of a thriving, if imperfect, democracy. And I keep emphasizing imperfect because it is entirely right to criticize certain aspects of Israeli policy. And the IRA definition never prohibits
Right.
normal criticism. And we need to understand that.
Yeah,
But
the
it's not,
opponents to it refuse to accept that. Let me read a question I've just seen from Professor Sean Egan that I think is very interesting and deep. And he says, there seems to be a disconnect between the discussion of anti-Semitism and the why question. There are transient hates that are based on one or other transient misunderstanding of cultural features of a group, but they disappear when people assimilate. Why is it that anti-Semitism does not go away but morphs over time? Why do we have it now in its new form?
well, it is not only anti Semitism that morphs. Uh, you look at the struggle for democracy anywhere. Democracy is not perfect. It can never be perfect. It can never be made perfectible because it involves a continuous fight against the negative instincts that live within all of us. And this is why the framers of the Constitution of the United States, some of the most brilliant people in human history, created a system of checks and balances. And that is so unlike Marxism. It is so unlike religious extreme theology, which talks about perfection and perfectibility. It talks about the notion that no one can be trusted with all the power, because if you have all the power, there's a tendency to corrupt, power, to corrupt the individual. And so anti-Semitism is a manifestation of that human frailty and of a tendency to be jealous of others, to blame others, to instead of trying to succeed, to try to take away other people's success. I always say that anti-Semitism is not about the bad things Jews have done. Anti-Semitism is about the good things that Jews have done. Anti-Semitism is about the achievements of the Jewish people, because the most negative aspect of anti-Semitism is to try to take that away. Notice this is talk about world domination, about Jewish money, about Jewish bankers owning everything, uh, and so it's why is it that an oppressed people should be living in wretched poverty on handouts and welfare, instead have produced more Nobel Prize winners than anyone else on a percentage basis. Maybe one fifth or quarter of Nobel Prize winners are Jews. When you look at every kind of endeavor in the sciences or in arts, Jews tend to be at the forefront, even though they represent such a tiny minority. And it's partly that success that Jews are blamed for. And that uh, is not just something that pertains to Jews, but it pertains often in societies where certain elements, whether it is extreme populism of the left or extreme populism of the right, I'm not talking about standard populism, but extreme forms of it, uh, they will try to look for those who have had success and take away that and blame them for that. In the 1930s, German Jews who were very highly assimilated were shocked by how virulent anti-Semitism became as the Nazis were taking power. Should not have surprised German Jews because anti-Semitism was always a huge problem in Germany. And if you look at German philosophers, so it was deeply embedded in that. Even people like Immanuel Kant, who had written some brilliant things, but it was also tainted by anti-Semitism. And so the argument made by many Jewish leaders was, why would you persecute Jews in Germany? And look how loyal Jews had been in Germany. Look how in the sciences, how in physics,
Mhm.
they had achieved phenomenal success, made astonishing contributions to German physics, how in chemistry, how in music, how in literature.
Right? Maybe
And,
today's Muslim Jews think that they are now assimilated and will be excluded when the
and
next pogrom happens.
but what was then shocking to them was that when they made this case of just how fantastic the contribution had been, that in every area of German science, culture, literature, they played a central role. The answer from the anti-Semite was, yes, that's the problem. You were you were dominant in that. And
Yes.
you notice under Nazism, they were denouncing Einsteinian physics.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so it was that success, not the failure.
Right. Just
And
one more quick question before we wrap it up, and that is that while you've spoken of the extreme left and right, you haven't mentioned the what I think is a contributing factor, which is the, and it'll sound pejorative, but the growing Muslim presence, because Islamism carries with it at its heart anti-Semitism also.
well, I would like to say that extreme forms of Islamism,
Mhm.
and extreme forms of all religions, sadly, have elements of that. Um History is complex, and we know that in Christianity, the level of anti-Semitism in Europe in the Middle Ages and so on, and this is why some of these words that we hear right now have an echo in the most vicious kind of medieval anti-Semitism. And when you look at the anti-Semitism of the extreme forms of Islamism, such as the Ayatollah Khamenei and Khomeini before that, there's almost a kind of medieval element of hatred in the rawness about it. And you naturally will see a coalescence of the extreme Islamists, and I emphasize extreme, and the extreme left, because in politics, this is often what happens. And Lenin, for example, was willing to make alliances with anyone against capitalism. So for Lenin, decolonization, even though he was a racist, um, was a useful tool because it would damage imperialism, which he said was a high stage of capitalism. So there's a kind of cynical alliance often on campuses between extreme Islam and extreme left. And it is a very toxic alliance to all sorts of freedoms.
Yes, there definitely seems to be an alliance. I have one question
But
here.
I want to emphasize that this does not represent the bulk of Islam. It does not represent the bulk of Christianity, or even the bulk of the left, but the extreme left and the extreme forms. Yes.
Right. I just think it has, yes, I agree. But it has seeped into so much that it seems to be more powerful than the numbers would describe, right? I have a
It,
question here from someone who says he's an academic, and how can academics on campus themselves speak up, and how can they act without themselves being shuttered by the opposition, if you like?
it's really difficult. I hate to say this, but there's not a tremendous amount of courage in the academic world, and we see in dictatorships and in totalitarian systems that often the academic world is the first to cave. And it is essential to organize. If you are alone, you're easy to pick off. Um, And we haven't really done that. We have abandoned often effective organizations on campuses. Perhaps they're being rebuilt now, but more should be done. And it's essential that we also protect students. So, for example, for years now, there have been professors who have put up these rainbow-colored symbols on their doors that this is a safe space for LGBTQ students. We have nothing like that for Jewish or Zionist students, where we can say to them, look, you can be mentored, you can be protected, or to junior faculty, people who are up for tenure or who are up for promotion to full professorship. We need to, the senior people should try to
Do that.
help those individuals to make sure that they are treated fairly, not privileged. At no point should Jewish students or non-Jewish Zionists ask for any privilege. They should never ask for anything more than others have. They should never settle for anything less.
That's a great closing remark. I really like that. And Professor Braun, if I send you a big banner saying "End Jew Hatred," will you put it up on your office door? Because that's what we're launching here. Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation wants to get people to understand that anti-Semitism is Jew hatred. If the word anti-Semitism is confusing, and people do confuse it, right? They like write anti/Semitism as though it's against the people who are Semites, but it's not. It's Jew hatred. We're the
No,
people.
it's a very specific term. It was not
Very
against
specific.
the
So
Semitic people. So sure.
maybe you can help us with pushing this message out across campus too. I really want to thank you. This was very helpful, very enlightening. The remarks that people have posted have all been to express their gratitude to you, Professor Braun, for being so very clear and concise. We do appreciate it. And on behalf of CAEF, thank you. And on behalf of the many people here, and may I also add to everybody listening that contributions to CAEF would go a long way to helping us to carry out the battle, to educate, inform, and advocate for the adoption of IHRA and the end to Jew hatred. The webinar has been recorded and will be sent to everybody that had registered. So I wish everyone a happy day and thank you for attending. Thank you, Dr. Braun.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.